Saturday morning. And isn't it great that the rain has stopped, but at least the rain did come, which is brilliant.
I'm going to talk about the power of food, and I think it is indeed important to think about food as having a significant impact on our health in an age where pharmaceuticals sometimes seem to dominate the approach to health and well-being. Now, we, and particularly those of you that are here today, are pretty much interested in getting healthier faster, living healthier for longer. I probably would consider to be in that category as well. Of course, not everybody's in that category, and there's always a bit of us that wants to just lash out and party and have a good time and not forget about or not even think about the impact on our health. But I think for all of us, particularly as we get older, we realise that we're not immortal, and looking after ourselves is really an important way to enjoy all of our days and to live it in a way that can give us the most joy. If you're a doctor, and probably your own doctors are always interested in, of course, looking after your health and making sure that your numbers, your physiological numbers, are on track. And amongst those are things like your cholesterol levels, your triglyceride levels, and in particular this is really important for diabetes because the risk of heart problems and circulatory problems are much greater. So there's a strong focus that your doctor will have on those levels, and probably for many of you are likely to be on medications to control cholesterol, and with good reason, and that is that those medications have been shown to help to reduce the risk of heart attack and stroke in some cases. Blood sugar levels, of course, are always front of mind and centre, and managing blood glucose levels is particularly important because they impact on the small vessels in our body, and particularly the eyes and our circulation. So keeping your blood glucose levels under control, I'm sure you're all aware of that. And then reducing blood pressure, because blood pressure can impact on your kidneys, and so making sure your blood pressure is in check. Of course, there are a lot of other things that your doctor will look at, but those are the key factors, and most likely many people will be on, in addition to lifestyle management, on particular medications for those particular parameters which are indicators of health. But really what I'm going to talk about today is the role that food can play on those parameters. While pharmaceuticals can certainly help and assist, there's a lot that we can do in terms of what we choose to do about what we eat and how we live our lives. And in particular weight management, because not overeating and perhaps eating a little bit less, even though you may not lose an awful lot of weight, even tiny amounts of weight loss can certainly impact on diabetes control. And just losing a few kilos will help to lower cholesterol levels and triglyceride levels. It will clearly have an effect on blood sugar levels and also will reduce blood pressure. In fact, your blood pressure will go down 1 millimetre of mercury for every kilogram weight that one loses. So lifestyle change has got a lot going for it, but there's also a lot of controversy about what aspects of lifestyle and what aspects of diet are really going to make that difference. I'm going to cover some of those controversies today. Now, just to illustrate, and I won't show you too many graphs today, but I really wanted to make this point at the very beginning to say that not only do we think that lifestyle change will make a difference, it's actually been proven in studies that have looked at how you can prevent diabetes and also how you manage diabetes. So this is a diabetes prevention study result graph that followed people over a 4-year period. A third of them were randomised to nothing, just business as usual. A third were provided with metformin as a blood glucose lowering drug, which some of you may be taking. And the others were given intensive lifestyle advice. So these are people who didn't have diabetes but who had a risk of diabetes, perhaps a family history of diabetes, and so on. And what this graph shows is that the placebo group, by the end of 4 years, almost 40% of them developed type 2 diabetes. The metformin group, it was around 30%. And then the group that had the lifestyle advice that included a little bit of weight loss and physical activity were able to be had the least likelihood of progression to type 2 diabetes, and only about 20%, or actually less than 20% of them developed type 2 diabetes. Now, this probably wasn't what the study team was expecting. They probably thought that metformin was going to be the most successful approach to preventing type 2 diabetes, but indeed it wasn't the case. And so in the setting of a research centre, having lifestyle advice that you provided with a lot of contact with professional people, dietitians, exercise physiologists, that was able to achieve those kinds of benefits because those people were getting an awful lot of support. The big challenge that we have in science is to make science relevant. So whilst this is really interesting, a really interesting result, the big question really is how to replicate that in the community in a way that is not going to cost an enormous amount of money to the government, and we term the words cost effective. And so there's a lot of work that is being done on different approaches to delivering lifestyle advice and seeing whether in fact that's a really effective approach to doing it. And our own research group at CSIRO is looking at some of these aspects. Yes, we do clinical research studies, and Penny's going to talk to you a little bit more about how you can volunteer for some of those research studies. So we're interested in the impact of diet on physiology, but we're also interested in approaches that might work in a community setting, and also how information and communication technology can help with that as well. So really, the bottom line is food is very powerful, lifestyle is very powerful, and sometimes that can be lost amidst medical management where the focus is on pharmaceuticals. Now, what should we be eating? And the general advice about healthy eating applies as much to people with diabetes as people who don't have diabetes. I don't really think that having diabetes should mean that you have to follow something extremely special. There might be some little tweaks about your eating pattern that might have to be a little bit different, but by and large, really healthy eating for the population is also healthy eating for type 2 diabetes. And these are the national recommendations and what dietitians would like us to eat. And I'm a dietitian too, so I guess I have to put myself in that boat. We talk about core foods. These are foods that are your basic foods: dairy foods, breads and cereals, fruits and vegetables, protein foods like meat, fish and chicken, and grain foods. And they're what we call core foods. But if you go into the supermarket, as I'm sure you do all the time, we have an awful number of aisles of food that don't fit those categories at all, and we call those non-core foods. So they would be foods like soft drinks and cakes and biscuits and pastries and chocolates and the things that we enjoy. And this particular recommendation doesn't suggest that you never have these foods, but that the amounts are relatively small, less than 20% of total calories should come from these foods, and if you're controlling your weight, probably even a little bit less than that. Now, that makes perfect sense, but how far is that from what most of us sometimes, actually do? So this is what Australians actually eat. The number of core foods are a whole lot less. We actually don't eat enough whole grain foods, we don't eat enough dairy, we certainly don't eat enough vegetables. And then 40% of our calories comes from those non-core foods, and they are the soft drinks, the cakes, the biscuits, etc. So we can try to reformulate healthy foods as much as we like, and that's a good thing. But we shouldn't forget the elephant in the room, and that is that those foods that are foods we like to eat are predominating in our eating patterns, and we should look at not necessarily cutting them out, but having much smaller serve sizes. So my approach would be that if you have those foods, that you have the best version of those foods and have them in small amounts. An example would be having a good tasting macaron. I don't think that would really send anybody's sugars out in any direction, provided the serve size was a good one. Okay, so they're kind of general principles. Eating basically good core healthy foods. Yes, making sure that the choice of those is the best of the bunch. So particularly in carbohydrate foods, you're all aware, whole grain, lower GI, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. With dairy, ideally lower fat, and so on. But really, the biggest issue is how much of those indulgence foods we tend to eat, and really cutting back on those. I'm going to talk about some of the controversies in these sorts of areas, and they include the controversy around carbohydrate, particularly high or low type, low GI, yes or no, and I'm particularly also going to talk about fats and eggs, what is there to know. And Penny is going to talk a little bit more about the power of food, and she's going to focus on the dietary pattern that we've been testing at CSIRO, but also another food that is in the vegetable category, which is mushrooms, and I'm looking forward to tasting some of the nice delicacies that you can make from mushrooms. So Penny will talk a little bit more about the power of mushrooms later on. Now, carbohydrate. When I started at CSIRO, there was an interest in this area. I had an interest in this area, and I can't believe that we're still talking about carbohydrates several years down the track, in fact decades down the track. And the diabetes recommendations have really gone in a lot of directions around carbohydrate, starting off from when I was a trained dietitian in the 70s to cutting out carbohydrate, keeping it as low as possible, but eating as much as you like of fats and cream and who knows what, to a period where fats became the demon. Fats were recommended to be cut down quite dramatically, carbohydrates increased radically, and that was the way to go. And now to sort of somewhere in the middle. But what does this really mean for type 2 diabetes? And this is a study that's been done in the US from a research group that has really tried to understand the physiological impact of different dietary patterns, and they've been interested in high protein diets with different levels of carbohydrate. And these are 3 different experiments that they did over a 5-week period in people with type 2 diabetes, and they measured hemoglobin A1C, that integrated measure of blood glucose control. And what they found was that when they had a diet that was 40% carbohydrate, a little bit lower than the control, the hemoglobin A1C went down, even in a 5-week period, because normally it's a sort of over a 3-month period you expect a change, but they saw a change pretty early. And incidentally, this study wasn't a weight loss study. This was actually keeping the same weight. What happens when you crank down carbohydrate, at least at the level of what happens to blood sugar. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other physiological impacts later. So the bottom line with this study is that the lower the carbohydrate, the lower your hemoglobin A1C. And despite the fact that this was published quite some time ago, it's taken quite a while for this research and similar research to really become mainstream because of a lot of anxieties around low carbohydrate diets. And at the moment, my colleague in particular, Dr. Grant Brinkworth, who's an exercise physiologist at CSIRO, and Penny and I are working on a dietary pattern that is low in carbohydrate but contains healthy fats, and looking at what impact that has on diabetes control, not just over a 5-week period but over a 2-year period. And we're very lucky here in South Australia that we've got some amazing people who are really willing to volunteer for these studies. And so we started off with about 80 or 90 people with type 2 diabetes in Adelaide, and they've been helping us with looking at these dietary patterns and the impact that it has on their blood sugar control, their blood fats, their blood pressure, and whether there are any impacts on other issues like kidney function and so on. But what's really remarkable, even at a 6-month period, is that we're seeing that even if you compare the low carbohydrate diet to the best practice eating pattern that we have now, which is moderate carbohydrate, low GI, that there are some additional benefits, and those people that were on the lower carbohydrate diet tended to need less medications and had less variations in their blood glucose level. But it's not achieved just by cutting out carbohydrate. There's more to it than that. And I hope that we can share what those dietary patterns were when that study is finished. It's really a little bit premature to do that at the moment, but really just making the point that there are many ways that you can improve your diabetes control and help to reduce the need for medication with lifestyle. And I should also point out that with that research, people weren't just on a particular diet. They also had an exercise program that included some resistance training too. And people really, they've enjoyed the pattern. Obviously, as a research study, they have to come into CSIRO on a relatively regular basis. But I'm sure most people, from at least my experience, have really enjoyed that experience. So maybe the trend now towards a little bit lower carbohydrate, but certainly that doesn't mean cutting out carbohydrate altogether at this point in time. The important thing is the quality of that carbohydrate. There's some really great pamphlets out there in the foyer about carbohydrate and different serve sizes, but also one on the GI of carbohydrate foods. So if you choose carbohydrate, don't have lots of carbohydrate foods, but make sure that they are lower in GI, because that means that they don't give you a big spike in blood glucose levels. Also, if you have too much of a low GI food, that can still increase your blood sugar level. So yes, choose low GI carbs, but don't overdo it with the amount of carbohydrate at any one time. And another study published in Europe that looked at if you lose weight, and in this particular study it wasn't people with type 2 diabetes, they were people who needed to lose weight. They lost weight on a meal replacement program, and then they were randomised to 4 different diets: high carbohydrate, low fat, high GI or low GI, high protein or low protein. And what they found in this study was that the people who were on the higher protein, moderate carbohydrate, low GI diet were able to maintain their weight loss for up to a year. This graph shows up to 6 months, but up to a year. So not only does the type of diet that you choose to eat affect your blood glucose levels and other levels, but it may mean that it may help with longer term weight loss. It's not clear entirely why this is occurring, but I suspect that part of it may be because high protein diets and lower GI diets tend to help with appetite control a lot more than a typically higher carbohydrate diet. So appetite control for all of us is a challenge, and trying to eat in moderation is a challenge, but it seems that higher carbohydrate and moderate carbohydrate, low GI and higher protein is the way to go. And in Australia, we have researchers who have looked at GI for many, many years from the University of Sydney, Dr. Jenny Brown-Miller, and they've developed a testing scheme with the GI symbol on foods that gives you an indicator of whether that food is high or low GI, because it's not intuitive. You can't tell whether bread, for example, even if it's whole grain, you can't tell that it's low GI necessarily. You actually have to have it tested. And so this is a symbol to look out for. And there's also a little book that is available commercially that has got the GI content of different foods. These are some of the foods that you may have been familiar with. Rice, you can have ordinary rice, but basmati rice in particular has a very slow, prolonged glucose response. So if you're having rice, that's a good option. Bergen bread is one example of a low GI bread. You probably can't see it from there, but that's got the GI symbol on there. Dairy foods like yogurt and milk, they contain a sugar called lactose, which is a low GI carbohydrate. So generally, dairy products will have a low GI. There are cereals that have low GI. I'm unashamedly going to put up the cereals that contain barley max, the CSIRO developed, which contain low GI carbohydrates, but there are other cereals like All Bran and others that are low GI too. Obviously, oats and porridge are a good low GI cereal to have. Potatoes are normally high GI, but there's a brand of potato called Charisma potato. I believe that it's available only through Coles, so you don't have to avoid potatoes altogether. If you do choose potato, then something like the Charisma potato is a good option. What's intriguing though is if you have ordinary potato and you cook it and then you cool it, that cooling process will change the starch so that it becomes low GI. So if you make some potato salad with a low-fat dressing, it will be low GI compared to if you have that potato straight out of the microwave or the boiling pan. A food that all dietitians will always recommend that we eat is legumes, those brown things. And some of us like them and some of us may not. It depends very much on the recipes though. I think these foods can be delicious. But I thought I would just refer to a legume that we all eat, and that's the humble pea. The pea is a legume, and I always say give peas a chance. Okay, so I've talked a bit about food and the power of food, and yes, what we eat it does make a difference, but also how we eat can make a difference. And there's quite a lot of research in how we eat that I think is worth pointing out because that can certainly impact on diabetes control. So eating frequency, what that means is how many times do you eat per day? And what this study showed, and it's a review of all of the studies that have been done in this area, is that if you ate more than 3 times a day, it didn't really affect your appetite that much, or it didn't really affect how much you ate. But if you ate less than 3 times a day, that was really bad news in terms of your appetite control. And it meant that you're more likely. So I guess the bottom line is having at least 3 square meals a day is a good thing, and skipping meals is not a good thing. And I'm sure that those of you with diabetes are pretty well tuned to having regular meals for all sorts of reasons. But generally for weight control, eating at regular times, whether it's 3 times a day or 6 times a day, is most conducive to containing your appetite and not overeating. What about when you eat? And this is really an interesting area. There is quite a lot of research that now is looking at our clock genes, would you believe, that regulate metabolism. And those clock genes are regulated by light and also by food intake, amongst other factors. What this study showed was that if you were an early eater, you tended to lose weight better than if you were a late eater. So this is really just a cross-sectional study. It's looking at people's eating patterns in terms of in a weight loss program and then identifying them as people who ate early and people who eat late. And the interesting finding is, the night owls tended to lose weight more slowly. And so trying to understand why this is quite intriguing. So interesting to reflect on whether you're an early person or a night person. Sleep timing, this could have something to do with sleep timing, food timing and weight. And what this study showed was that late sleepers, people that went to bed late, ate more calories at dinner and after 8 o'clock had higher fast food intake, soft drink and lower fruit and vegetable consumption. Again, this is cross-sectionally just watching people's behaviour and showing that, interestingly, late sleepers had these kinds of patterns. Late sleepers had poorer eating patterns. And that calories eaten after 8 o'clock, when they controlled for everything else, seemed to predict excess weight. So it's suggestive that eating after 8 o'clock may increase the risk of weight gain, and that even if you control for the timing of sleep and how much sleep you have, that still seemed to be the case. Now, does that mean you should never eat after 8 o'clock? Of course not, but it really is saying, on average, in terms of your normal patterns of eating, it may be, this suggests that it may be a good idea not to eat late at night and try and contain your main meal to somewhat less than that. And it could also be that this relates to sleep and eating patterns. So this little cartoon says, hickory dickory dock, the gene for the body clock was removed from some mice. They got fatter by twice, hickory dickory dock. So it's a cute little cartoon, but basically it's reflecting the research that says that reduced sleep affects your metabolic rate and also affects your gut hormones, the hormones that register whether you feel hungry or not hungry, or you feel satisfied or not satisfied, full or not full, and therefore weight gain is more likely. So getting into a rhythm of sleep is important. So regular meal patterns, adequate sleep, and what this study showed too was that somehow amidst all of this, higher protein diets also tended to assist in weight control, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the role of higher protein patterns in diabetes control in a moment. So not just what you eat, but it's getting a good night's sleep, having a regular pattern, and certainly not eating late at night. And we focus so much on just the food, we need to also consider some of those broader issues too. Okay, so we will now start to talk about the food and some of the issues, and one of the foods that are high in protein are eggs. What about eggs as a protein food? And the reason we're talking about eggs is because they're so controversial. Everybody has a different perspective about eggs. Different doctors think differently about eggs, and they've been a much maligned food for many a long time. And they're a wonderful food. They taste great. They do contain protein, and they contain a lot of other things too. This is a slide that shows how much protein they contain, all the different foods. You can see per 100 grams how much protein they contain. They're not as high as something like beef or chicken, but they're certainly up there. Then they're higher than your peas and legumes, and they're higher than chickpeas. So they do have a role to play in a higher protein diet. But do they? Are they bad for you? Could they increase your cholesterol levels? Are they really that good? They might have protein, but what about the other things that they contain? And it may surprise you that eggs have a similar fat content to other protein foods. And in fact, probably the foods that have got the highest level of fat is something like cheese, but then this is per 100 grams, and you probably won't eat 100 grams of cheese at one sitting, but you could eat a 100-gram piece of steak at one sitting. So whilst this is per 100 grams, don't necessarily think that when you're having a slice of cheese you're having a massive amount of fat, because you won't be. So really the little red bar is the saturated fat, and I know that saturated fat has been in the press a lot over the past few months. How many people saw the Catalyst program on the ABC? Ooh, not that many of you. Okay, good. All right. Anyway, the bottom line with that program was really trying to do a bit of creating a bit of a hornet's nest around whether or not we should cut down on saturated fat, and I think that the argument that they had was that really it doesn't affect heart attacks at all. And I think unfortunately a lot of the real messages got somewhat scrambled. Saturated fat isn't the only thing that you need to look at in healthy eating, and sometimes we overemphasise particular things, and we probably have emphasised saturated fat a little too much. It's important to keep it low, but also if you reduce saturated fat, you're going to reduce the calories of what you eat too. So yeah, it's a good reason to reduce it. So you can see that something like lean beef has only got 1.6 grams per 100 gram, lamb's a little bit higher at 2.4, skinless chicken around 2, pork it's quite low in fat if it's lean pork, 1.4 grams per 100 grams, fresh fish 2.2, eggs 3.1, not that much greater, and tofu for those of you that are vegetarian. So eggs really, they're not a major source of fat. One of the things about eggs that I think is really important is not just its nutritional qualities, but the fact that they don't cost that much. You know, they contain an amazing amount of nutrition, but when you look at their relative cost per 100 grams, per 100 gram serve, really they're pretty low, and they come second to tofu. Certainly much less expensive than meat or chicken, and a whole lot more expensive than oily fish like salmon, which is a good food. Of course, it contains fish oils, which can be important for good health, but you know, when it comes to budgeting, eggs as a protein source. So you know, having a meal that replaces meat with eggs in an omelette, for example, is a pretty good cost saving and a pretty reasonable switch when it comes to providing protein. But what about that little niggle of concern about eggs and cholesterol levels and so on? And even though there's quite a lot of studies that have shown that the cholesterol in food really doesn't have much of an effect on blood cholesterol, it's really the saturated fat in food that affects blood cholesterol. Despite that, the issue is more if you have type 2 diabetes, where there is the potential for more risk around blood cholesterol levels. Are eggs going to be a problem, and are people with diabetes more responsive to cholesterol in eggs than other people? So this study was really looking at taking people with diabetes, putting them on a high protein weight management diet, and looking at the two different versions of that eating pattern, one that contained the usual meat, fish, chicken sources of protein, and the other one where that was replaced several days a week with eggs. And we were interested in looking at what the effects were on LDL cholesterol, and also whether there was any effect on weight loss, on glucose control, on HbA1c, but also on food cravings. We're really quite interested in the effect of diet on food cravings as well, because sometimes you hear that, you know, if I cut out all these things, I'm going to crave them more. So we were interested in testing whether or not that was really true. So, sorry to get a bit scientific here, but it was what we call a parallel study. We recruited several people with type 2 diabetes. It was about 50 or 60 people. Half of them were assigned the high protein, high egg pattern. The other group were assigned the high protein, low egg pattern. The diets were similar in all other respects. The amount of vegetable, the amount of grain, the amount of fats was the same on both of those dietary patterns. Just so that you can, I don't know whether you can really see this from the back, but the slides will be available. But you can see that your basic sort of weight loss diet, a grain food at breakfast, low-fat dairy foods, 2 pieces of fruit, plenty of vegetable, a little bit of oil. You don't have to cut out oils and spreads altogether. We don't need to be that fat phobic as long as they're healthy fats. It's okay. Bread and also some indulgence foods. So you know, there's always a place for indulgence foods. So you can see that the diets were relatively similar, except the egg group had 2 eggs a day, so they actually had 14 eggs a week, and the other group had none. So if we're going to see an effect, you would think having 14 eggs a week, we would see something, wouldn't you? Okay. Did weight change in the 2 diets? And pretty much the answer to that is categorically no. The high egg diet's the blue one, the low egg diet is the green one, and there was absolutely no difference in how much weight they lost over that 12-week period, they all did pretty well. The LDL cholesterol, and this is probably hard to see, but really it didn't shift much at all. And if you do the statistics behind this, basically what this is saying is that there was no effect on LDL cholesterol in this group of people with type 2 diabetes having 14 eggs a week. And I can't tell you how many milligrams of cholesterol that was, but it was certainly a very large amount. So cholesterol, LDL cholesterol did not budge. There's another blood fat that can be high in type 2 diabetes and sometimes in general, which we call triglycerides. Who's heard of triglycerides before? Okay, great. So really well-versed audience. So keeping triglycerides low is important. Those of you that are on some statin drugs, they help to lower triglycerides too. A lot of carbohydrate will push up triglycerides. Too much alcohol can push up triglycerides. Weight loss will reduce triglycerides. What we see in this study is that triglycerides went down from roughly 1.8 to about 1.4, 1.5, and the reduction was the same irrespective of whether people were on the high egg diet or the low egg diet. What about blood sugar levels? Again, you can see that blood sugar levels went down. This was fasting blood sugar. We did all sorts of other measures of blood sugar like continuous glucose monitoring over the day. I won't go through those, but this is really just an indication of how blood sugar fared in this study and the tracking over time. You can see that it started off at just under 8, and then in the first 2 weeks it went down to just below, probably about 6.8. So what you see, I think the important thing about this graph is that if you change what you eat, the impact on your blood sugar and also on many other physiological functions is going to be obvious within the first 2 weeks. It's going to be obvious within the first week. It might even be pretty obvious in the first few days. And that's a function of eating a little bit less. So eating less than your body needs and eating a healthy diet will in fact have an effect that you will experience very, very early, and then it steadies off after that. So both diets were very effective in achieving that. What about food cravings? And we measured food cravings by questionnaire. There's a particular questionnaire that we use that we asked people at the beginning before they started the study about whether they, what foods they craved and the types of foods and whether they were salty foods or sweet foods or fatty foods. And we asked them the same thing again at the end of that 12 weeks. And what we found was that cravings for sweet and carbohydrate foods decreased on both diets. Now, these diets were high protein, relatively moderate carbohydrate diets. So carbohydrate was less than probably what they would normally be eating. And it didn't result in people feeling that they wanted to eat more. So once you get into a pattern and a rhythm of eating a high protein, low carbohydrate diet or other dietary patterns, you will find that your desire for those other foods will decrease. On the other hand, if you constantly expose your taste buds to those foods, it becomes more difficult. And it has some analogies to addiction theory, although the role of food in addiction is still highly controversial. I personally think there's some link there, but actually at the moment the science is really only suggestive. And with alcohol, abstinence tends to be advantageous rather than having little bits. And it may be that with food and cravings that avoidance and delaying introducing those foods may be better than having little bits of those foods all the time. So I think that this is interesting in that those cravings were decreased over that period of time. So just getting back to eggs, what do we know about them? 7 grams of high-quality protein per egg, which is equivalent of about an ounce or 30 grams of meat or chicken in terms of protein amount. They're very nutrient dense. They don't just contain protein. They contain folate, they contain B vitamins, they contain pigments that are really important for the eyes. They really are a really fabulous nutritional package. They are very filling. I don't know if you've ever tried eating more than 2 eggs at a meal, but get to 3 and 4 and you're really struggling. There's only so much that you can eat. So they are very satisfying. They're convenient. They're a bit for vegetarians. Obviously, they're a good protein option. They don't cost that much. And in particular, a quota on eggs. The Heart Foundation did a very detailed review of the literature, as did the Egg Nutrition Council, on what number of eggs were not associated with any risks at all, and what they concluded that having up to 7 eggs on average per week is okay. So if you have 14 one week and none in the other, that's still an average of 7 a week. So that gives you pretty much a fair bit of room to move. On average, Australians would eat maybe 2 to 3 eggs a week. So, for all of us, really, I don't think there's really much of a need to cut out eggs unless you've been told otherwise by your doctor. So, just to finish off this talk and just to summarise everything, diet and lifestyle can be as powerful as diabetes drugs, as I showed you with the diabetes prevention program. The trend at the moment is lower carbohydrate equals lower blood sugar, so don't overdo it with carbohydrate foods. But when you do choose carbs, low GI carbs are definitely the way to go. There is a lot more evidence around higher protein, moderate carbohydrate, low GI diets. Penny's going to talk a little bit more about that, and that these can be helpful for the short-term weight loss as well as the longer term. As a protein within a high-protein diet, eggs can be included, and they contain a lot of other nutrients, and up to 7 eggs a week on average it seems to be associated with no increased risks. And then finally, it's not just what you eat, but how, and having regular meals, avoiding eating late, and getting a good night's sleep can help with appetite control, and hopefully also in optimising any efforts that you might have around managing weight. And then just a bit of a plug for volunteering and the power of volunteering. We're always undertaking studies at CSIRO. We're just about to move to the new South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute building, which is called the Big Cheese Grater. Some of you may have seen. It's a very exciting new building, and it'll have a new clinical nutrition clinic. We have a database of people who have expressed interest in participating in different studies, and we're hoping that some of you may put your hands up and have an interest in doing so. And Penny will talk to you a little bit more about that. South Australia is wonderful in terms of the altruism that people have, and I think SA generally is a more altruistic city than some of the other cities. People really, we do have a lot of people that volunteer, but people with type 2 diabetes, because there are so many other competing studies in the diabetes area, particularly pharmaceutical studies, we kind of compete with those. So we'd really be interested in having you participate in being on those in that database, and we encourage you to give that some considered thought. So that's all that I have for now. I hope that I've kept to time, and more than happy to answer questions now, but I'll be around at morning tea and enjoying some of the tasty morsels that we've got, but happy to answer any questions as well. Well, when we eat fat, we on average might eat maybe 70, 80, 90 grams of fat a day. The amount of cholesterol in food we measure in milligrams. So it's a really, really tiny subset of fat, and a different structure to saturated fat. So the effect that cholesterol has on blood cholesterol is very, very minuscule compared to the effect that saturated fat has, because the amount of saturated fat in grams is so much greater in food than the little bit of cholesterol, even in eggs. Okay, thank you for that question. And it is the question that comes up pretty regularly about high protein diets. First of all, when we're talking about these eating patterns, the absolute amount of protein is not massive. It's still within the range of what people are eating. It's around 100 grams of protein per day, and people would eat, on average, men would eat that amount anyway. So a high protein diet is relatively high protein. It's not massively high protein. The second thing is that if you reduce blood glucose levels and lose weight on a high protein pattern, the things that drive impaired kidney function is poor glucose control by a large extent. So if you improve your glucose control, your kidney function will tend to follow that. The third thing is that we can't just rely on that as a theory. We've actually tested the effect of high protein diets on renal function. With all of our studies, we look at what the impact is on GFR and all of the other markers of renal function, and we don't see any adverse effects. In the people that we have in our studies, though, we screen out people who've got kidney malfunction. That said, Dr. Peter Clifton, who is a colleague of mine who has been involved in a lot of this research, did a study where he recruited people with marginal renal function and put them either on a higher protein diet or a low protein diet for a year. And again, he did not see any adverse effects. So the bottom line is, if you control your blood glucose and lose weight on that high protein diet, the whole diet is what's giving you the benefit, and the protein isn't really having any adverse effects at all. So the whole dietary pattern certainly is beneficial. So I think that the protein and kidney function is a controversy, but the science that has been published does not suggest that there are any adverse effects, provided blood glucose level is controlled, and that's really the linchpin. The same applies to bone health. So there were some studies that show that if you eat more protein, you excrete more calcium. In the dietary patterns that we've looked at, that does not occur. The amount of calcium you excrete goes down. The reason that's different to those early studies is that those studies were done with a purified protein source. These are whole dietary patterns, and that's a very different thing to just looking at a purified protein source. So there's an overstated risk concern about bone health and kidney health. Really, the evidence does not indicate any adverse effects. The cooking really won't alter anything of any great consequence in terms of the fats when you use butter or margarine. So there was a suggestion that if you cook with margarine or with oils, the heat changes the fats in some way and turns them to trans fats. That in fact doesn't occur. What does occur is if you burn fats, particularly oils, there's oxidation that occurs, but for that oxidation to be truly damaging, you really have to, that oil would have to be virtually black, so it doesn't increase trans fats. With regards to the type of fat, butter versus margarine, if you're trying to keep your cholesterol level under control, I would certainly be advocating an unsaturated margarine. And if you do have butter from time to time, the butter oil mixes would be the better option. So the spreadable butters have got a little bit of oil added, so less saturated fat. But in terms of the best options, oils would be number one, the unsaturated margarines number two, and then number three, butter with the oil blends. But certainly it would be a poor third, albeit a reasonable tasting third. We've done studies at CSIRO where you get 20 people and you give them even just glucose or a food. The variability in that glucose response is enormous, and what you get with that GI number is an average. And you know, the range that you get, you know, for an individual, it could be much lower or much higher. So I think because of the imprecision of the measurement, low GI is probably as good as you need to have to be able to make a sensible decision. Worrying whether it's 48 or 52 or 55 or whatever, it probably won't make that big a difference at the individual level, just because the variability is so high. And you know, for you as an individual, if it says 55 on the label, it might be for you 45 and for someone else 65. So it's a rough indicator of the propensity of that food to raise glucose. And I think the symbol is probably a good, simple guide. If you want to look at it in more detail, Jenny Brain Miller has a little book with all of the GI foods that have been tested and the actual GI on those. So, if some people like to sort of follow it to the T, and if you want to do that, that's okay. But generally speaking, I think the symbol is a way of just trying to make it simpler, because there's enough things that you've got to worry about when you've got diabetes, as well as worrying about the GI. So hope that's answered your question. Oat bran does lower your cholesterol, but you have to have a fair bit of it. The studies that have looked at oat bran tested a cup of oat bran, and that was able to lower cholesterol on average by around 5%. So it does, and it probably lowers cholesterol more effectively than just oats themselves. But you do have to have a fair bit of it, certainly a good food to include in your pantry. And sometimes, the science takes a while to catch up with what's actually happening, and I think that the anti-low carb sentiment has been one of those that has meant that perhaps some of the research hadn't been done as early as it should have been. But there's a very strong groundswell of people who are on low carb that say, it really has worked for me. It helps my appetite control. It helps me lose weight. So I think the important thing for us is that we do provide advice around what is a healthy low carb diet, and I think what you've described sounds pretty good. And to go from an HbA1c of 7.9 to 5, I mean, not too many. I'm not sure even your glucose lowering drugs will achieve that. So I think it's a good note to finish on that. That's a pretty amazing power of food.